I'll enter your
There is no doubt that castles, where history has indeed marked deaths and dramas, are the perfect settings to feed the legends. In modern-day Britain, we deny the existence of ghosts, yet at the same time, we are afraid of them. Ghosts take many forms, from shackled skeletons clanking through graveyards, to spectral balls of light smelling of sulfur, which has been reported on sites of ancient battlefields. There are royal ghosts, unnamed ghosts, kind ghosts, cruel ghosts, traditional and legendary ones, some well documented, and some seen only by a privileged few.
Henry VIII, the second Tudor monarch, was born in 1491. He is the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. So he is declared Duke of York as a child, and he's always intended to be a great nobleman, but of course isn't raised to become king. When his brother dies, everything changes for Henry. He's declared Prince of Wales, and he now becomes the sole focus of his father's ambitions and his father's efforts, because his father has no brothers. He has no other surviving sons. So Henry VIII is the future of the Tudor dynasty.
Henry VIII became King of England in 1509. He started as a good monarch, sensible, reasonable, and pleasant, but his behavior changed drastically later. Over the years, Henry VIII suffered a series of illnesses and injuries, slowly changing him from athletic and robust to the overweight, bloated, tyrannical king that many recall today. Not even fine clothing and jewels could hide the physical weight and bodily troubles the king was suffering. He became irritable, intolerant, violent, and tyrannical. In January 1536, Henry had a severe jousting accident and was unconscious for 2 hours. It is generally believed that this accident played a significant role in his personality change.
Henry VIII loved jousting, and it is an incredibly dangerous sport. Once in his youth, actually, he came close to being killed when he forgot to put the visor down on his helmet, and his friend, the Duke of Suffolk, didn't notice and jousted at him, and actually the lance splintered, and he was very lucky to survive. Not long after Henry's death, in fact, Henry II of France will die in just such a similar jousting accident. So it's a really dangerous sport. And in early 1533, Henry was taking part in a joust when he fell badly and his horse landed on top of him. And there's a lot of controversy over this accident, over just how serious it was. One account suggests that he was unconscious for several hours. So it's unclear exactly what the extent of the damage was. Certainly, it is the cause of his disablement. His leg never recovers, and it's from this point that he starts to gain weight. Anne Boleyn would blame her final miscarriage, which happens in January 1533, on the news of the king's accident. And there are also suggestions that perhaps there is some sort of brain damage caused by this fall. And I think that that is quite debatable, in that there are signs that Henry was already the ruthless king that we certainly see later in his life from before the accident. But certainly it was a major event. And it really hammered home to the king and to his court that by January 1533, he still did not have a legitimate male heir.
Letters of that time indicate that the change began insidiously in 1534 and became most drastic in 1535, a year before the accident. Henry had suffered from leg ulcers before and after the accident and had been constantly treated for them for many years. Many medications used to treat these ulcers contain a high proportion of lead in various forms. Lead can be absorbed through the skin, significantly damaging the skin. Absorbed lead can affect the brain, causing psychiatric problems, especially those associated with violence. His reign is usually remembered for the king's 6 wives and his legendary appetite. Infamously, he sent 2 of his wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, to their deaths on the executioner's block at the Tower of London. But it is too easy to think of Henry VIII simply as the terrible monster of his bloated old age, shuffling painfully through Hampton Court Palace.
As a young child, Henry was rather precocious. He was very well educated, but also had a reputation for being quite cheeky. He did have a fondness for religion, but also for athleticism. He was known for his abilities on the tilt yard and also at things like wrestling. So Henry really was a golden child. He very much enjoyed the studious side of life, but also the more fun elements of it too.
Henry was once an energetic little boy, adored and indulged until his elder brother Arthur's death placed a vast, unexpected burden on this second son. Henry's beloved mother, Elizabeth of York, died 2 years later, and his protective father, Henry VII, kept his precious heir cosseted and restricted. Many of his actions as king still resonate today. In many ways, Henry VIII made our modern world. The break with Rome, the Reformation, and the dissolution of the monasteries had profound and lasting effects. He was a paradox, a strong ruler, yet an anxious, insecure man. Henry was a golden youth before a great series of losses and misadventures took their toll. Perhaps these go some way to explain his behavior and gradual decline. How can one adequately describe Henry's personality? Imagine yourself as Henry VIII, the second son, suddenly yanked into the spotlight by your older brother's death, sheltered and smothered by a father suddenly aware that he has just one heir left, handsome and intelligent, and by turns, both recklessly indulged and then denied. Any of us would have emerged a mass of contradictions and frustrations. So Henry VIII, crowned king at the prime of his life, just 18 years old and physically magnificent, with more enthusiasm and energy than most of his contemporaries, became a conflicted and confused man.
Henry VII was never a popular king. Most of his court feared him. So on his death, there is a sense of celebration, of joy that England is now going to get this young and charismatic king. Henry VIII very much resembled his grandfather, Edward IV, who'd been very, very popular. And there is a real sense of hope for the future. He's seen as a true Renaissance prince. He's highly educated. He's incredibly good looking. The young Henry VIII was described as so beautiful, he'd make a pretty woman. He's athletic, he's very into his sports, he's very muscular and well-built, he's very, very tall. So he is a king of which England can be proud, and there is very much celebration at his accession to the throne in 1509.
Henry VIII can best be described as a young man as a golden prince. He was very much conversant in the language of courtly love. He enjoyed singing, dancing, composing music, and also playing instruments. But he was also very athletic. He enjoyed riding, hunting, and taking part in combat sports such as the joust royal and also wrestling. But Henry also had a brilliant mind. He was a studious and devout scholar of theology and had a very devout faith. So Henry was a bit of an all-rounder.
But it is a shame to let the last 20 years of his life colour the interpretation of his entire life. One should not see him as simply an ogre king who beheaded 2 wives, divorced 2 others, and rejected another in one of the most humiliating ways possible. His personality was unique. His intelligence, learning, and curiosity impressed even the world-weary ambassadors who littered his court. His thirst for knowledge was insatiable, though it never became the near mania that haunted Philip II. Henry VIII didn't spend his declining years surrounded by slips of paper detailing the most minute occurrences in his realm. But he did spend his entire reign reading dispatches, scribbling notations, and meeting with diplomats and politicians. Very little occurred in England that escaped his attention. Indeed, very little happened in Europe that escaped Henry VIII. He prided himself on this, and he should. The Spanish ambassador reported that Henry knew of the fall of Cadiz before the Holy Roman Emperor. He was usually a genial company. He loved music and wrote his own. He enjoyed dancing and entertainment, and held countless banquets and tournaments. He enjoyed all physical activities, and excelled at most of them. Hunting, archery, tennis, jousting, the king made his court an endless round of competition and celebration. When he grew older, these former pleasures became torments. Like most former athletes, Henry became fat as he aged, and the once loved pastimes became bitter reminders of the ravages of time. And he ruled over a country where almost half the population was 18 years old or younger. The youth was everywhere, staring the aged king in the face. We can imagine the effects. He naturally sought reassurances from women, courtiers, and the council. Affairs could distract him, but love affairs were never his grand passion. Despite his passionate reputation, Henry VIII was a 16th century sexual prude. Among his European contemporaries, he philandered the least. State affairs indulged his taste for war and glory. Family affairs gnawed his conscience and pride. But Henry VIII did not want distractions. He wanted a grand mission, a defining statement. Ultimately, he got his wish in the most improbable way possible. He began life as a second son, destined for the church. It was the dream of Henry VII for his eldest son Arthur to be king, and for his second son Henry to be the highest churchman in England. And so, for the first 10 years of his life, Henry was a student of theology, and for the next 30 years of his life, he remained a dutiful son of the church. It is ironic, then, that his most significant historic achievement was the destruction of the Roman Catholic faith in England. The impact of the Henrician Reformation forever altered the course of English history. Henry VIII, who had indulged in endless diplomatic squabbles and foreign wars, left no grand achievement beyond his borders. Vast amounts of money were spent on these foreign entanglements, and many lives were lost. But in the end, nothing changed in the European balance of power. England, constantly pulled between the 2 great continental forces of France and the Holy Roman Empire, nearly bankrupted itself to become respected and feared. Why did Henry ultimately fail in those tasks, usually reserved for monarchs? Eventually, he was a victim of his time. The 16th century was a confusing mess of changing loyalties, betrayals, near constant fighting, and most importantly, a rising skepticism of that great institution of the fading medieval world, the Roman Catholic Church. With the advent of the printing press a century before, literacy and intellectual debate proliferated. The High Renaissance in Italy occurred during the first 20 years of Henry VIII's reign. It was a time of unparalleled scientific experimentation, intellectual fervor, and spirited debate. In such a time, traditional views of kingship were bound to change for the ruler and those he ruled. While reading any biography of Henry VIII, one must remember the flavor of his times and judge him by 16th century standards. It's always amusing to read descriptions of Henry as the lustful tyrant, torn between bedding and beheading innocent women. In truth, he blushed at dirty jokes and was more faithful than many 21st century husbands.
The Henrican Reformation really only comes about for one reason, so that Henry can annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. But it soon becomes clear to both Thomas Cromwell, his chief minister, and to the king that there are going to be many benefits of being a head of one's own church. For example, there was great wealth in the monastic houses, the monasteries throughout the land. Now, typically that wealth was funneled to Rome, to the Pope. But Henry VIII now realized that he could profit from those exorbitantly wealthy institutions. So we begin to see a real shift in the landscape of the country. Firstly, the smaller monasteries are dismantled and all of the wealth is funneled back to the crown and really into the coffers of the nobility. Now, this caused great disturbance throughout the country. We have to remember that most of the country is still traditionally Catholic. They rely upon the monasteries not only for education, but also for shelter. They really act as almost the safety net of the country. And these beloved institutions are being stripped away and funneled into the coffers of the nobility and the crown. This causes enormous tension throughout the country. There are increased rioting and also rebellions. And this leads to enormous bloodshed and tension throughout the country.
He was married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years and had just a handful of mistresses. He waited years to consummate his relationship with Anne Boleyn physically, and despite being in the prime of his life, remained faithful to her until marriage. Was his sexual prudery a result of his early church training? Perhaps. Whatever the case, it was a hallmark of his life. Henry VIII was always an incurable romantic. His personal and political decisions were always grandiose and dramatic, and played for significant effect. He loved pomp and pageantry, even as he loathed to deal with the consequences of his actions. Like his father, he was caught transitioning from medieval England to Renaissance England. And like his father, he was well versed in English history and desperate to continue the Tudor dynasty, to secure his claims to Ireland, Scotland, and France, to raise England to the status of its continental neighbours, and to expand his God-given right to rule all Englishmen. His political ambitions failed, and he bequeathed a woeful mess to his 9-year-old heir, Edward VI. His most outstanding achievement was dubious, and he was often eager to distance himself. The Henrician Reformation, the end of Roman Catholicism in England, and the birth of the Anglican Church.
Where Wolsey had failed, Anne herself held the key. She was incredibly bold and placed in the king's hands a copy of William Tyndale's The Obedience of the Christian Man. Now, this was a banned book in England. These were books that Wolsey had previously burned. But this was an explosive book. This book told Henry that there was no pope in Rome, there was no authority in Rome, and that the king was next to God. This really sowed the seeds in Henry's mind that he was above the Pope, that he could form his own church in England. And there was a man who would be prepared to do that for him, Thomas Cromwell.
Henry VIII had been ill on and off for the latter part of 1546, and just before Christmas he leaves the Queen and his daughter Mary and goes to Westminster. And it's clear very quickly that he's dying. He spends his last few weeks cloistered away with his council, and particularly his secretary, William Paget, who is very close to Edward Seymour, Henry's brother-in-law, the brother of Queen Jane, and the uncle of the heir to the throne. During this period, Henry asks that a new will is drawn up. He'd previously made a will in the early days of his marriage to Catherine Parr, and he seems to have named her as regent in the event of his death. But this new will completely overturned that. Instead of naming anyone as regent, Henry in fact established a council of equal ranking executors. So all of these men have an equal role to play, and it was hoped that they would guide Edward through his minority and into his adult reign. There's quite a lot of question marks over the validity of Henry's will, and it may have been signed with a stamp of his signature rather than his signature itself, which would make it invalid. However, it's clear that it was drawn up on his wishes, and certainly it doesn't really benefit anyone. Anyone who might have wanted to forge the will, actually, it really wouldn't have done them any favours, particularly Edward Seymour, who was clearly hoping for the regency. In his final days, really only William Paget and Edward Seymour have access to the king. When he dies, they keep the death secret to the extent that food is still brought to his chamber. And this is to give Edward Seymour time to ride to Hertford to go and acquire his nephew, the new king. And he brings him to London. Paget has the will, and together they are able to secure the appointment of Edward Seymour as Lord Protector. So he becomes regent to Edward VI. So they override Henry VIII's wishes.
On Friday, the 28th of January, 1547, the man who had started his reign as a virtuous prince died at Whitehall Palace. He was aged 55. Henry saw his confessor the day before his death and received Holy Communion. Although death was imminent, not even Henry's doctors had the courage to break the news to the king. It was, after all, treason to predict the king's death. It was, though, also imperative that a man has time to prepare his soul. So Sir Anthony Denny undertook the dangerous task of warning his master that in man's judgment he was not likely to live and should remember his sins, as becometh every good Christian man to do. Henry responded by saying that he believed that Christ in all his mercy would pardon me all my sins, yea, though they were more significant than can be.
Henry VIII had broken with the church in Rome, but did maintain his own Catholic church. But Henry's tolerance for those with reformist ideas came to an end towards the end of his life, and Henry was very much engaged in persecuting those who held a Protestant faith. Now, rather unfortunately for Henry, one such person who held reformist ideas was Queen Catherine Parr, his wife, who was a devout Protestant. And Catherine liked to challenge Henry on religious ideas. She was a very intelligent woman and loved to engage in debate about reform and new ideas and ways of thinking. Henry's minister, Archbishop Gardiner, was very much active in persecuting Protestants, and even threatened the life of Queen Catherine Parr and the women in her household. Indeed, one of Catherine Parr's associates, Anne Askew, was racked in the Tower of London and then burnt at the stake. Indeed, Henry was persuaded to sign an arrest warrant for his sixth and final queen. But Catherine Parr was able to do what the other previous two wives who were arrested were unable to do, in that she got to Henry and was able to plead her case, and she did so amiably. The charges were dismissed and Catherine was safe.
Henry VIII was undoubtedly correct on this matter. His sins were greater than can be. Although the exact number of people executed by order of King Henry VIII is unknown, and estimates vary widely, some suggest that the total could have been as high as 72,000, yet other estimates are much lower. The second half of Henry's reign was stained with the execution of wives, relatives, close friends, and confidants. Henry must have feared for his soul only 9 days before his death. He executed his last victim, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey. It is no wonder Henry's last known words were about summoning Archbishop Cranmer to his side. Denny asked the king whether he wanted any learned man to speak with, and the king responded that if he had any, it should be Dr. Cranmer. But I will first take a little sleep, and then, as I feel myself, I will advise upon the matter. Some time after midnight, on the 28th of January, Cranmer was summoned to the king's bedside, but Henry was past speech when he arrived. Derek Wilson describes how, in the end, there was no master and servant, no prince and churchman, just a priest preparing a departing soul for eternity. Cranmer begged Henry to give a sign that he trusted Christ for salvation, and in response, he felt the grip on his hand tighten slightly. It was an evangelical departure, no anointing, no reading of Latin prayers, just a simple acknowledgement of the all-sufficient atoning work of Christ. Cranmer would have been glad of that. Shortly afterwards, at around 2 a.m., King Henry VIII left this world. The exact cause of the king's death is uncertain, although Alison Weir believes it was likely to have been a pulmonary embolism. For the following 2 days after Henry's death, his body remained undisturbed in his chamber. His passing was kept a secret, so much so that his meals were still being brought to his lodgings. It was not until the morning of the 31st of January that Lord Chancellor Rosalie announced to Parliament, through a steady stream of tears, that Henry VIII was dead.
After years of ill health, Henry VIII finally dies in 1547, leaving the throne to his son, Edward, who was only 9 years old. Henry was acutely aware of the difficulties of child rulers. Henry appointed a regency council for his son, and Edward then appointed a Lord Protector, his uncle Edward Seymour.
To some, Henry was Great Harry, the man who rescued England from the tyranny of the Roman Church, the Renaissance prince, the ruler of the most magnificent court in English history, and patron to the arts. Yet to others he was a tyrant, an unmerciful monster that murdered hundreds, almost bankrupted his treasury in pursuit of glory, and the person responsible for the destruction of hundreds of abbeys and churches. One of Henry's earliest biographers, William Thomas, wrote in the year of Henry's death and declared that the king was undoubtedly the rarest man that lived in his time. I say not this to make him a god, nor in all his doings. I will not say he has been a saint. He did many evil things, but not as a cruel tyrant or as a hypocrite. I wot not where, in all the histories I have read, to find one equal to him. And after 464 years, Thomas's declaration remains faithful, for Henry VIII still has no equal.
It's very difficult to state whether Henry VIII truly loved any of his wives. I think he respected many of them. I think he was besotted with most of them, and he was obsessed certainly by Anne Boleyn. But ultimately, I think Henry only had room to love one person, and that was himself. I think we're all still so obsessed with the Tudors because of how unrealistic it all is. If this had been the work of fiction, we would think it was pushing credulity. I mean, this is a family who killed one another. This is a family who had a king with 6 queens who killed 2 of them. This is a family with feuding siblings. It has everything for us to enjoy, and we can't get enough of it.
While the palace has been used by the monarchy ever since, and is a considerable public draw today, public interest and infamy lie with the tumultuous Tudor era. Arguably the most commonly referenced event in Hampton Court's history relates to the imprisonment and death of 3 of Henry VIII's unfortunate wives. To begin, the rarely seen Anne Boleyn. The apartments above the palace's gatehouse, intended to house Anne Boleyn, were still under construction when the Queen was led to the Tower to be executed. Anne was held at Hampton Court, awaiting her execution, as her husband busied himself with the next fertile object of his affections. Anne is an exceptionally mobile spectre, seen across many countrywide royal haunts, but supposedly spends many hours walking down the corridors of Hampton Court, wearing a blue or black dress, screaming. Similarly and fittingly, she is occasionally seen running corridors while clutching her severed head. Henry VIII's beloved third wife, Jane Seymour, died a few days after giving birth to Prince Edward in October 1537. Her ghost is said to be less dramatic and vengeful than the 2 that accompany her, but wanders around the rooms in sorrow, described by Hampton Court as a sad white wraith carrying a lighted taper. While Henry was thrilled to have the male heir he had longed for finally, he was devastated at the death of his perfect wife. Jane is said to appear on the Silver Stick Stairs, a staircase that once led to the room in which she gave birth and later died. Her apparition is far less frequent than others, appearing only on her son's birth anniversary. Jane was also the only one of Henry's wives to join him in his royal tomb at Windsor Castle. Henry VIII's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, was most famously executed on generally considered false accusations of adultery and treason in 1542. She is said to haunt the palace in a particularly unmissable vocal style, gaining her the nickname the Screaming Queen. Catherine, aged only 19, was beheaded at the Tower of London in 1542, but was arrested at Hampton Court. Upon her arrest, she broke free from the guards and ran, screaming down a corridor called the Haunted Gallery, viscerally screaming for the king to be merciful. She was accosted before finding Henry, who was praying in the chapel, and never saw him again. Her ghost is said to repeat this screaming journey perpetually, never reaching her cruel king. Catherine's ghost continues to pop up in snaps to this day. In 2015, coach driver Trevor Tighe was visiting the palace when a photo of the palace's marble staircase appeared to show the Queen's ghost. The pictures were sent straight to the press, where, with the help of some circles, the spirit is clear for all to see. Hampton Court is not only home to royal spirits, but also their servants. The ghost of the Grey Lady is said to be the ghost of Sybil Penn, servant to 4 Tudor monarchs and wet nurse to Edward VI. Her death came at the hands of smallpox through her devotion to her duties. When Elizabeth I caught the pox in 1562, Sybil nursed her throughout her illness. But while Elizabeth recovered, Sybil contracted the disease and died shortly after that. There were supposedly no reports of a haunting until her tomb was disturbed in 1829, after which sightings of a Grey Lady were frequently reported. Allegedly, the servant is also linked to the sound of an old spinning wheel, which could never be attributed to a living cause. These mysterious sounds emitting from behind a wall were vindicated when an old spinning wheel was unearthed in the same spot during renovations. In 2003, CCTV at the palace caught the image of a supposed spectre throwing open some fire doors. As staff and security were accounted for, and the footage was shown worldwide to great acclaim. On the second day, doors swung open again, and this time a ghostly figure could be seen, which many believed to be the ghost of King Henry VIII. But many people have since named the spirit Skeletor. On the third day, the doors swung open again, but nothing was seen. It was not just the security staff who reported seeing something strange. A visitor wrote in the palace's visitor book that she thought she had also seen the apparition of a large man near the same doors. Windsor Castle has stood for over 1,000 years, and its past has a lot of ghostly stories to tell. Many royals and common folk have died within the castle walls and grounds. The ghost of Henry VIII is one of the most famous ghosts of the castle. Several people working in the castle and visitors report hearing the king in the cloisters. He has also been seen wandering the corridors, groaning in pain and dragging his ulcerated leg, which caused his death in 1547. Witnesses often describe him as a large, angry ghost, pacing furiously and shouting occasionally.
The Tudor dynasty was defined by a change in religion, a consolidation of power, and also the ability to look outwards and both inwards. This is an era defined by great cultural advances in the arts, but also as an age of exploration and empire. The Tudors really are central to our sense of national identity.
The Tudor dynasty is an era of such big characters. We have Henry VIII, we have Anne Boleyn, we have Elizabeth I, but we also have non-royals. We have Thomas Cromwell, we have William Cecil, we have Robert Dudley trying to marry the Queen. These individuals are so interesting in themselves. And it's also an age of big events. It's where the Reformation happens. It's the age of William Shakespeare, so we have the stage, we have the first permanent theatres. It's the age of exploration. We have Sir Walter Raleigh attempting to plant his first European colony in the New World. So there are big events and there are big personalities. And there are also surprising things like the 6 Wives of Henry VIII, which really draws people's attention because it was unprecedented. It was seen as bizarre, even crazy, that the king had 6 wives back in the 16th century, and today it still holds our interest. There was no dynasty like the Tudor dynasty for drama.
Formidable in appearance, memory and mind, and fearsome of temper, he attracted genuine devotion and knew how to charm people. Monstrously egotistical and surrounded by adoration, he nevertheless kept a reasonable grasp on the possible. Forever taking false steps in politics, he emerged essentially unbeaten and superficially victorious in nearly everything he attempted to do. Though cold, self-centered, ungiving, and forever suspicious of the ways of the world, he could not descend to the second stereotype. Despite a ruthlessness fed by self-righteousness, he never took the pleasure in killing required of the first. Perhaps this is why his callousness and cruelty continue to plague the halls of his most beloved castles, even in death.
May I be your lover, when there's no longer to mourn or to weep. Struck down for a heart I may be and dying. Let down your drawbridge, I'll enter your